Our guest today is one of the true good guys in tech and an accomplished leader. Alan Paulin was early at Square, where he played a pivotal role in building Cash App from inception. Cash App, of course, is one of the most successful payments platforms in the world. Today, Alan is the co-founder and CEO of Flint, which is revolutionizing performance management. We talk about the art of scaling, leadership, and the impact of great talent. Let's jump in. Alan, again, appreciate you being here and was very much looking forward to this conversation. I'd love to, maybe start off by diving into your background. I understand that you are, technical by skill, but very entrepreneurial. And maybe we start off with your whole Cash App story, because I think that's a really intriguing and an exciting place to start.
Yeah, I've been a little lucky in my career, but it's been over 20 years. I'm a software engineer, I guess, by trade, and I've worked my way from large companies like Microsoft and Google down to my last two have been startups, including Flint that I've founded at the beginning of 2023. In 2013, I was fortunate to join Square when Square was essentially a couple hundred person startup, and joined the Cash App team. This was before it was called Cash App, when it was a Hack Week idea that was being productionized. And it was quite an amazing, first week or two on the job. I essentially joined, immediately began working on Cash App. For other engineers listening, I merged my first PR on my second day there, and continued at a fast pace right afterwards. The 7 days in, I came into the office, and I was in San Francisco for this, which traveling for Square called it Square One. And I came in and learned very quickly that the tech lead for the Cash App project had just left to go do a startup. And I was informed, hey, they're out, and you and your fellow coworkers in the Waterloo office are in. Let's take this Cash App to the promised land, and let's go. And we ran from there and never stopped.
So in those first few weeks, Alan, when you are looking at this whole Cash App project, what were you thinking to yourself? What were you thinking that this could become? What was going through your mind?
It was interesting because we talked a bit about this as a team back then, and no one knew exactly where it would go. We were a P2P, like a payments transfer service at the time. In fact, the first version of Cash App wasn't even an app at all. It was an email service. I don't even know how to describe it, because we literally allowed you to send a payment by sending an email. And what's interesting about that in terms of startups is it was a really novel idea that nobody was doing, but nobody knew if it was a good idea or not. And so we built the way for you to send payments via email, and there was tons of excitement and interest. And what was interesting in that first summer time period, we were working like mad. We were all there, kind of supporting each other. And as we got closer to a launch, we were thinking, like, this really needs an app. Like email is a nice gimmick, but is that really how we want everyone using this in the long run? And so on September 1st, I remember this very vividly, we decided to build apps. And we would have an iOS app and an Android app. And given the tight timeline that we wanted to launch on, we didn't even build what I would call real apps. We almost built essentially a shim over your email app that helped you understand the product. You could have it on your home screen. You could easily pick the amount you wanted to send. And then we would hand you off to email and make it a little easier to link a debit card. And what was cool about this was I was the one who put my hand up, or was the lucky volunteer to build the Android app. And that was kind of 6 weeks of my life that I'm never getting back. It was wild. It was fun. I was working with some amazing Android engineers at the time, helping me along the way. And 6 weeks later was when we launched. I remember because I spent the last day before the launch polishing the animation around when you're selecting the amount of money to send, and it was this really cool look to it, and that was like how we helped basically launch Cash App, and away we went. So it was a wild first 6 months.
Very, very interesting. If you reflect back in those early days and you think about the team that was working on this with you, are there qualities or traits or things that stand out to you about that team?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like, uh, anytime you go through, I feel like what we went through in those first 6 months. First of all, it builds a bond that is almost like no other in life, where you were there for each other, helping each other, working really hard. But in hindsight as well, like this was a almost hand-picked team of people who were generally amazing at what they do, great at their craft, great at their dedication, and also willing to kind of do what it takes to get things across the finish line. And many of them have gone on to do amazing things after Cash App. Many of them are at working on Cash App as well in extremely senior positions at this point. So it was great to kind of be with a team that we all felt like we were learning from each other, and nobody wanted to let each other down, and that combination was really great to get through the early days when we were moving very fast with very few people.
You mentioned culture, and that word is thrown around a ton as it pertains to startups and T building. Obviously, it's very important. And I know it's an area that you're passionate about. You hear culture fit. And I was recently having a conversation with someone and they said, culture fit is good and necessary to build a good team, but what about culture add? Bringing on people that are additive to the culture. What's your take on that? Curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I actually really like that take in general because I think especially when team sizes are small, we are all contributors to the culture. Uh, in other words, we can all influence it and slightly shape it in a way that either makes more sense to us, or we bring aspects of our experience. And I think this is what people really are looking for when we're talking about like diverse hiring and trying to bring in people from different walks of life and different experiences. At Flint, we do this with, I want to make sure that with an engineering background, I'm bringing in people that complement that and can bring industry specific experience to the table. People who come from different types of backgrounds. It's great because we all get to mold it slightly, and while at the same time trying to help people come in and thrive in the current culture, there's a little bit of assimilation that goes on there, while people can still bring their uniqueness.
There was an article in nature.com recently, um, and it talked about founding teams and the DNA of founding teams. And in this article, it talked about how the most successful founding teams or early teams at startups, the people on the teams come from diverse backgrounds. They have different experiences, different ways of thinking about things, different ways of solving problems, different personality sets. And I mean, it rings true. You know what I mean? Like, you can't build a team of all the same person. You know what I mean? You can't have a bunch of point guards on a basketball team. It's probably not going to work out. You know what I mean? You need someone to cover the 7-footer. So I think that resonates quite a bit.
Yeah, and I feel like whether it's a founding team or just starting a new team within a larger organization, those principles apply. I know, and we haven't dove into this yet, but in founding Flint with my co-founder James Blashill, James and I had never worked together at the same company prior to founding together. And I think that makes us a rare exception, and we probably violate some rules along the way there. Turns out for anyone listening that any rules you hear about startups are all made up anyways, and everyone has to kind of chart their own path. You'll hear advice from 1,000 people in 1,000 different directions that all conflicts with each other, and so it's impossible to follow even if you wanted to. So it's kind of one of those things where listen, absorb, digest, and then make your choice. And I say make a deliberate choice, but even sometimes then it's in the face of wild ambiguity, and you put your best foot forward. Be looking for feedback yourself, and adjust and adapt as you go. So it's been great working with James. Spoiler for the story. We turns out we work really well together, and even though we both have engineering backgrounds, we do come from different, either types of engineering and different companies that have used different strategies, and so we haven't always had the exact same approach, and it's been great kind of meshing those ideas together for what we're doing now.
What is Flint? What's the mission vision? What are you trying to achieve?
Flint is our current startup where we're looking to basically help organizations bring a culture of feedback and accountability and alignment. You can think of us as either a feedback platform or a performance review platform, but we're approaching it from a whole new direction compared to what I would call traditional HR software. One of our big missions, and it's been interesting seeing this kind of take hold a little bit in the industry, is we feel pretty strongly that companies would be way better off, and individuals in companies would be way better off if they ditched the annual performance review and moved to a model that was much more frequent, continuous, and aimed towards growth and development of their people. And that sounds easy in principle, and turns out there's a lot of nuance to both the inertia that the industry has and how you would ultimately both support managers and support individuals, and ultimately support people teams and company leaders. Like there's a lot of different roles at play here, and it's been really fascinating, kind of navigating that, learning how to help each of them in their own ways to build a product that really resonates.
Was that something that you and James, came together and said, "Hey, we want to start a startup together, and we don't really know what we're tackling," and kind of came to this? Or was it, "Hey, this is something that you've been ruminating on for a while," and James had some sort of specific background in this? How did it come to be?
It's funny that there's actually a little bit of both of those in the story. So maybe if I go back a few years, during my time at Cash App, I was very heavily involved in trying to influence kind of what I would call like company policy and procedures on people team type things. How do we help the promotion process get to the best results with the least amount of work? How do we help the hiring process get to the best hires? When you're doing more than 10,000 interviews a year, you have a machine that is constantly moving. And so, how do you get involved in that and really make a difference for the people you're hiring and the people who are involved as interviewers, et cetera? But the idea of Flint actually took some evolution to get to. And I think this is something that probably doesn't get talked about enough in startup circles, that especially in the early days of startups or even pre the startup forming, a lot of ideas go by and a lot of ideas get discussed. The original thing that we thought we could make a real impact on was helping connect people to give feedback, who otherwise didn't realize they could give feedback to each other when they were working on the same things or the same projects, et cetera. And that's still something that I think we will do in the long run. But there were so many other opportunities in the space that we've kind of put that one on the back burner for the moment and picked up a few other ones around even just helping people collect feedback on the work that they're doing, and realizing that most systems weren't collecting feedback in a way that was particularly helpful to people. It wasn't timely, it wasn't contextual, and that was something James and I both had a passion for. We both realized in various management roles that the platforms and tooling we had weren't supporting us the way we were hoping for, and that's really where kind of Flint took off from.
Maybe a quick question for you on Flint to date today. What have you learned from speaking with customers, prospective customers, on talent development, on how, I mean, you know me, right? Like, I'm so passionate about team building and great talent and the impact that can have on a startup. How do you get the most out of great people? What have you learned?
So one interesting aspect to what we've learned over the first, we're coming up on a year here, is the problem of how do we get the most from people with the whatever the people process that we have, whether you call that feedback, whether you call that performance management, whether you're thinking about an annual review. One resonates with people that the current things that people are doing are either not working or are so much work that, like, if you ask people, do you like your company's annual review, you can pretty much guarantee with 95+% accuracy that you're going to hear negative things. And so there's this real opportunity there, right? Of like, okay, here's the problem. The problem is that people haven't figured out the best way to create alignment, to help people understand what the opportunities are, to understand how to develop and grow and get the right feedback, either feedback from you as a manager, feedback from their peers, or just how to slowly make behavioral changes, which are hard, to make improvements.
I think one thing I'll say to you, Alan, is like, you know, having worked with various companies, at an earlier stage and then helping them scale and grow, you see how important great people are to an organization. Like, how literally make or break it is to the trajectory of that company to get the right people and the right team. And obviously, there's so much that goes into that, right? But if you have a great performer who's, a handful of times more productive, an A player, 10x talent, whatever you want to call it, and if you can get the most, it's not a given that they're going to be 10x, that they're going to be super productive. There's a part of the rest of the team, the context, the culture, reviews. How do you get the most? How do you motivate them? If you can do all of that properly or better than it's being done, there's probably some sort of significant ROI there. You know what I mean? And I guess that's what you're trying to unlock. Alan, you are, you know, helping people teams, helping startups, get the most out of their people, right? And we're in a technological shift today compared to a year ago, with the advancements of AI. Is there anything that stands out to you in terms of how people work, whether that's from an engineering perspective? I know, you're trained as an engineer, or in how you're building your company, or what you've heard from others in the teams that they're building. What skills are more relevant today? I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge topic, of course, given here we are in 2023, 2024. Uh, First things, everyone at this point, I hope, is using AI to some degree in their job. I know certainly at Flint we are all using AI often, both in the product as well as in how we build the product or build our marketing site, things like that. Oftentimes, if ever you feel like you've got writer's block, it's an easy way to help. And one of the ways that we think of it right now, and AI, the state is constantly changing, is I like the idea of using AI to help draft things or kickstart ideas. And then I think we're still in a phase where humans are best positioned to make sure things are ultimately looking good and have the message and point that you want. And so, like, I look at even things like, um, you know, take an annual performance review. What if we reframe that as an annual performance summary and think of it as, here's all of the work you've done and feedback you've collected over the years. Can we use a little bit of AI to summarize that nicely? And therefore, all of the time that people are investing or have invested in the past that makes things painful about this process suddenly melts into, I have a draft I can start with and wrap up fairly quickly. And I think that's where AI can be really powerful. Even when it comes to writing smaller things, or if I'm trying to think about how I might give feedback to someone, wouldn't it be great to have something, if I can write in bullet points and it can start me off, and then I can put it in my own words. Uh, and I find all of those things are super valuable ways of kind of using the technology so that we can move faster and ultimately achieve successful ends with less time invested. I think we're still ultimately in a world where people are super important, and AI's biggest role will be maybe amplifying what people can do in a given amount of time. And that's kind of what I'm seeing right now, and where I think it's going to go for the next little bit. But things are changing so fast that the sky's the limit.
That's great, Alan. I'd like to pivot a little bit here to family and working as an entrepreneur in a high-paced setting. You know, my understanding is you have family, you've two teenagers. I've a son who's 4, a daughter who just turned 2, and not really sure what we were thinking, but we have a third on the way in a couple months. And finding that happy medium, if it's at all possible, between work and family is a constant challenge. What's your approach? What are your thoughts? I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, well, we play man-to-man defense, and you're about to play zone defense. So we'll see how that goes in the long run. A couple things. So one is, family is really important to me. Has been for a while. I had the luxury of I had a coach maybe 8 years ago, like a leadership coach who really helped me dive into my own values, and it really made me realize how much I valued family. Um, an example of this, I actually used to. My son plays baseball, still does, and I was, and I guess am still a coach or assistant coach on his team. And there were times when games would have been early enough that he would get dropped off at the office, and we would both change into our full baseball uniforms, including hats and tight pants and all that stuff, and then we would go off to the game. And I remember, it was always good for a laugh here or there with my coworkers. You don't often see people in full baseball uniforms in the office, but what it made me realize, and a few people approached me afterwards, and I really appreciate them saying this, is seeing me able to prioritize family and leave the office at this would have been a before 5 p.m. kind of time, and obviously show that I'm going off to do something with family. It enabled them to be able to do the same. People kind of take the lead where various leaders are leading, and so that was great. It allowed them to see, hey, we can be genuine, and we can have interests outside of work while still being incredibly dedicated to work. And so I think that was super great to hear, and I'm glad I helped impact a few people that way. But yeah, I try to spend time with the family, and while still being amazingly dedicated to work, and it is an interesting balance. I'm not even sure balance is the right word, because sometimes if your daughter has a dance recital, then that's going to take priority at that for that 3 hours, and I'm going to flex my work around uh, that family event. And there's going to be times when work is crazy, and for a particular day, I may be very deep into it, and may that may be what's important that day. And the trick is to make sure that you're being true to yourself, and true to your own values.
Startups require, I think, a level of speed and dedication and intensity. It's not, you're not signing up to work, simply 8 to 4 or whatever it is, right? Like it's just not really the job. Um, but it's being flexible and accepting that I think things with family may at times come into that, and being able to flex around it. And, um, so yeah, again, probably for a whole separate conversation, but, I've also tried to learn how to delegate, and I'm not a great delegator at all. I'm brutal. I'm trying to get better at it. But if you don't delegate, you'll miss bath time, and I don't want that to happen. You know what I mean? So
I totally hear you, and I 100% agree. It's hard. Um, Everyone will have a different balance, or way to do it. It reminds me when I joined Square back in 2013. This was another, let's call it, family decision, where my wife and I realized this was joining a startup where it was going to be demanding on my time. This is not a decision I make single-handedly, and it was something that we kind of both went into with eyes wide open. And that summer, this is like basically my first 3 months on the job, we had a family vacation up in Muskoka to a cottage plant. And I remember thinking this was going to be a challenge. I hadn't been there that long. How would it be perceived? And so, one, it was important to go with my family, and we had a great time. Two, I remember in the car on the way up, my wife drove and I was in the passenger seat coding. And I got 2 PRs written, and that's what it took. And maybe I wasn't present for the car ride, but I was there when we got to the dock, and could spend some time with the kids that way. So there are trade-offs, and I still remember that. And for some people, that may not have been the right balance. For me, doing it that way worked, and it was great to have family support uh, making that happen, and also to spend the time with the kids, and really kind of enjoy.
I love that. And I mean, a part of that is the expectation that I think you and your partner, your wife, had together, that hey, there were going to be some moments that were going to be chaotic, right? And to be able to embrace that, and and that's kind of how it goes. Question for you: how was the internet in the car ride up north there? It must have been a little spotty.
Probably non-existent, and I'm pretty sure I was tethered to my phone. And yeah, fortunately, the tools were good enough to be able to work offline.
Gotcha. That's great. Cool, Alan. I want to leave off with a final question for you. You've you've worked at successful startups. You've seen what's worked. You've seen what hasn't worked. You've seen challenges along the way. What advice would you have to a first time entrepreneur, or not even a first time entrepreneur, just a startup founder, that is building and trying to push something forward? What comes to your mind?
First of all, this is an exciting time to do that. I feel like, with the state of the economy right now, a lot of the larger tech companies, or companies in general, are either pausing hiring or laying off. And I think we're going to see a whole new breed of startups. So, I was actually talking to someone earlier today, literally about this topic, where they were thinking about this and looking for advice. And so, for starters, it is not easy. Everything we hear about, it's hard. I definitely echo that fact. I love that it's hard because I think when we come through this on the other side and look back at the first year or two, you'd be like, wow, this is the stuff we didn't know at the time, and this is what we learned. So having that mindset where curiosity is really important. The other example I'll have here is that part of startups that make them successful is their ability to try things quickly, and using the analogy of if you can try a new idea every, let's say, week, you're getting 52 ideas tried in a year. If you can only do one a quarter, you only get 4 shots. So any advice to a startup would be to keep your velocity high and be able to experiment and try things, because you never quite know exactly what's going to work. And I think what's got us to where we are now is iteration. Being able to try something, tweak it, try it again, tweak it, etc. Finding those early partners who are going to be able to give you that kind of feedback, so that you can iterate is really critical. And you don't always know where they're going to come from. Sometimes you find an amazing partner when you least expect it. So being open-minded to finding, to being having shots at success. I don't think startups ever have a perfect success ratio, and so the best startup founders, I think, give themselves lots of opportunity. And of course, I'm going to end it here with something that's going to feel counterintuitive. You're going to have 100 or 1,000 people giving you advice, and all of that advice is going to be contradicting each other. And so at the end of the day, as a startup founder, you've got to take the path you think is right. And it's not going to follow everyone's advice. In fact, it may not even follow anyone's advice. With the best intentions of listening to what people are suggesting or what's worked in the past, and then figure out what works for you. Go for it with an open mind that you can try something and keep changing it. And that's my advice for future founders.